everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. ATSA is pleased to have you join us. Today's webinar is hosted by the ATSA Training Department and the Roadway Worker Safety Council, and is the first in a series of 5 webinars. My name is Donna Clark, and I will be your moderator for today. The title of today's session is Road Safety 101, and we expect it to be about 1 hour in length. We ask that you keep your line muted during the webinar unless you are speaking. If during the webinar you have a question or comment, we ask that you utilize the chat feature. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Alex Kelly of Salt & Company. Alex, take it away.
Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you so much to everybody who is joining us here today from all over the place. I'm really excited to be here. And as Donna mentioned, I'm going to be presenting to you today a bit of a road safety 101. So it's kind of like we're going back to school. So without further ado, I'll kick off my presentation here and we will be good to go. All right. So like I mentioned, Alex Kelly, and I'm the CEO and founder of Salt & Company, and I'll get a little bit more into what I'm all about a little bit later in the presentation. But I figure if you're here today, this picture on the screen may be something that's quite similar to your daily work zone. Maybe you're working on the side of the road, or you're organizing a team that goes out there and does critical work to ensure transportation and safety happen every day flawlessly. And when I look at road safety, I look at the entire environment. So my kind of bird's eye view looks a little bit more like this. My background in health, public health, nonprofit, and transportation all come together much like this highway to look at all the various determinants or the factors that go into road safety. So there's kind of that bird's eye view, but then we're also really interested in what the cyclist or the commercial delivery driver, what their sort of perspective is. Similarly, we may start to think about road safety and the impact that autonomous shuttles, like this one here from Europe, may have on our day-to-day reality in terms of transportation and road safety. Then we start to think about all of our vulnerable road users. So just like those cyclists, there's other people on the road that maybe aren't as protected. So whether that's a roadside worker or a child getting off a school bus and navigating their way across a crosswalk, these are people that need to be taken care of, and we need to make sure that the transportation innovations and technology advancements we have in place actually do that effectively. And then we start to really widen our lens when we start to think about technology and how it impacts how people get around, but also how future vehicles get around. So this is a fascinating sort of screen grab in terms of technology like LiDAR that is starting to revolutionize how self-driving cars actually make their way through roadways, coming to neighborhoods near you if they're not already there. And then we start to look at a totally different perspective, whether that's the engineering or technology and development side that creates all of this technology that allows innovation to happen. And so these are all different critical areas for thinking when it comes to road safety. And that's where I come to the question about staying in your lane. And this is the crux of our presentation today. And don't worry, I'll get into kind of what we're doing here, but really this is where I wanted to start the presentation today. Because we know that when it comes to transportation, conventional wisdom is always telling us to stay in our lane. The safe thing to do is really only depart if you need to pass somebody. But for the purposes of our presentation today, I'm playing with that concept a little bit. I like to do a lot of communications and marketing, so I play with some terminology. And it can be really easy when you're staying in your lane in terms of an organizational or a business case. It's really easy to stay in your lane. That's your comfort zone. You're sticking to your industry. That's what you know. And that could be something like lines, signs, engineering, depending on where in that transportation spectrum you fall rather. However, when it comes to Salt & Company, we like to think of the fact that you should never really stay in your lane. And I mean that completely 100% figuratively, because safety is number one. That is why I started this company. But there's power in getting out of your lane and looking at opportunities in industries that might be adjacent to yours. There's opportunities that lay in partnership and storytelling and even elegant strategic decisions that help you to really maximize the rest of the industry and what's happening. And so that's why we have Road Safety 101. Today is a bit of a primer to help you understand what else is happening in that ecosystem so that you can start to borrow, adapt, partner with different actors in this space and really help to strengthen your own safety protocols, but also be active and engaged in that safety environment that exists beyond the four walls of your company. So that's where collaborating with those adjacent industries, with government, with even your local media contacts, it allows for greater innovation and learning. And understanding the trends that are cropping up, whether it's micromobility or self-driving cars, it allows your business model to stay current and shift and evolve proactively. And that helps you just plan and forecast appropriately. So really, that's kind of the space that we're playing in today, is veering outside of your lane to make your organization better, connecting you to your community, and playing an active role not only in people's lives, but also in the bigger policies that impact it all. And that's where I think we're all here with a common goal. Safety is a job that we all do together, and aligning with people outside of your lane will help you do it more effectively. So that's what we're here today all about. And like I mentioned, a bit of an introduction on me. So I'm a road safety and transportation strategist, and I'm passionate about the work that I do. And I founded my company, Salt & Company, about over 5 years ago. And I'm a very excited new member of the ATSA Roadway Worker Protection Council, which we'll talk a little bit more about at the end of the presentation. During my career, I also had the opportunity to hold the directorship of Canada's first Vision Zero Advocate Institute, and probably connected with a lot of you at a couple of ATSA expos and conventions over the years in that role. I've had the opportunity to work with amazing clients like Uber, helping them to define partnership and connecting with industry leaders, ATS Traffic to help them define a whole new business opportunity to connect with community, and Only Insurance, which is a digital insurance provider, helping them to really hone in on their road safety narrative and become an ally within the larger road safety ecosystem we talked about. And really, at the end of the day, what I'm about is really helping organizations that want to impact the future. I help them define what that looks like through strategy, and then make a powerful impact through communications and storytelling, and leveraging their network through partnerships so that they can do great things together. So that's what I'm all about. This is the curly hair version. The picture is the straight hair version, but I'm the same person, don't worry. And I'm really excited to launch into this presentation today. So like I've touched on in Road Safety 101 today, we're going to really understand some of the leading road safety frameworks. And I think that that's an important sort of groundwork to establish, because those road safety frameworks can really dictate how road safety looks and feels in your community and in your industry. Then we're going to dive into a smattering or an appetizer of some current trends and innovations that are really changing the road safety landscape. So these are just a select few of some things that are happening in the space that I think are really interesting. And with each example, I'll give you some opportunities or discussion points about how you can really leverage those trends and the innovations in your operations. And it may not be your typical ideas. It may be a bit of a stretch, but all of these opportunities can lead you to better partnership, better communications, and better strategy when it comes to road safety. And it'll help not only protect the people within your organization, the people who are on the front lines doing that important work, but also your larger community that surrounds you. And if I've already said a lot and you're scrambling to take notes, that's fantastic. But I do want to let all of you know that there is an accompanying resource for this presentation today. And I believe Donna's put it in the chat, or will if she hasn't already, but it's available at saltandcompany.co/ATSA resources. And you can get that and download it. So I've summarized everything in there. So don't don't be afraid if you can't get everything down. I know I talk a lot. So without further ado, let's jump into Road Safety 101. So I've touched on this a little bit more, but Road Safety 101, the whole idea behind this presentation when I was designing it with Donna and the rest of the ATSA team was, how can we plug ATSA members and stakeholders into that larger ecosystem? Chances are you're doing fantastic work anyways, but the speed that everything evolves and moves is so fast these days. Sometimes it's hard to kind of grapple with what's actually happening. So that's today's presentation. And the idea is it'll plug you in and connect you with stakeholders, help you understand concerns from different angles that may be different than your day-to-day business case, helps you make better business decisions when you know what's coming down the pipeline. And it'll help you to discuss maybe policy and regulatory changes that impact your business. So that's something if you've got a government relations strategy already in place, or you're part of the lobbying efforts within ATSA, this is something that will help you. And if you're not currently doing that, I would highly recommend you consider that as part of your business strategy. Will also help you communicate and market your business better. If you understand the concerns of your local town council or potentially some of the charitable organizations or even other businesses, if you understand what's happening in their reality and their day-to-day, that'll help you communicate with them better. And then finally, it's the last point, but one of the top points in my mind is to help protect your team and your organization against risk. Some of the technology evolution that we see today is fantastic. It's phenomenal. It'll help us be better, but some of it is still going through a growth period and evolving within itself. And so it's important to know what's happening so that you can make policy decisions internally that ensure that people who are especially working on the roadside are protected and that your organization is thinking in terms of a bigger space in terms of that risk. And we'll talk a little bit more at the end about some ways that you can really develop and hone in on those skills. But today, again, is a sample of some of the things to think about. So first of all, we'll move into road safety frameworks. And like I mentioned, this is really important because road safety frameworks are these pillars of focus and they pull from evidence-informed theory. So, researchers, engineering experts, all of these really informed people have put together the best practice evidence around how road safety can and should unfold. And frameworks are also helpful because they allow us to organize objectives and really hone in on measurable outcomes. So again, it keeps things really aligned and strategic. And then from there, we build them out usually into clear action plans or steps. And this again helps to keep things manageable and allows us to assign both responsibility and outcomes. Also, frameworks, sometimes they're not one size fits all. So you'll see that different frameworks may focus on different demographics or even geographic focus areas to, again, focus in, allow resources, individuals, organizations to align on a common objective and then go all in on it. And then also frameworks are beautiful because they allow for those SMART goal setting. So if you don't remember that acronym, it's the specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and timely operations. So there's really a purpose behind these frameworks. And believe it or not, if you're not closely aligned with some of the ones that are out there, probably some of the work that you're doing is evidence or it is a byproduct of some of the frameworks that are currently out there already. And the image here on the screen, the one UN vision for road safety, is a great example. The UN, the United Nations, obviously, they have a lot of frameworks around different health outcomes, but even internally, they have their own frameworks for road safety. So this graphic is actually from their internal operations framework for transportation safety. So it's interesting that you can have frameworks that are massive, that impact, a country or the entire world, as the United Nations does, a country, a state or a province, a city, a town, or even an organization. And again, it's just really helpful to lay out objectives. So with that, I wanted to touch on three different frameworks that you may have already heard about that, again, will be helpful in guiding your work. So the first one that's been getting a lot of press in the last number of years is Vision Zero. And this is the idea that there should be no serious injuries and fatalities from transportation-related incidents on our road. Excuse me. And it has its origins in Sweden from the late 90s. And recently it's received, I'd say in the last 10 years, a lot of attention throughout North America. Excuse me. And it's been adapted across different demographics. So we've seen a lot of promising progress in focusing on children and youth. That's a smaller goal to set, of having 0 deaths within a certain age group. We've also seen modified targets, as the US government has done, instead of just focusing on 0 as the absolute goal, talking about or using language around towards 0 to really drive home the point that we're moving towards a goal, and any action towards that goal is fantastic. And we're all sort of combining on this effort together. And really it takes the idea of a traditional approach and flips it on its ear and says there's a lot that we can do to prevent deaths. And this systems approach can be applied to effectively do that. So that's Vision Zero for you. Then we get into another example, and I love this one, and we're seeing a lot of traction across North America with the complete streets idea. And this is really more of a specific approach for designing safe roadways. And it's a really inclusive one. And you'll see in the graphic on the screen there that Complete Streets takes into account all of the different road users, how they're using transportation roadways, and ensuring that everybody has their own space to be able to move effectively and safely. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but again, this is a framework that's now starting to impact how we engineer streets and how we ensure that people are safe as they're getting from point A to B. And then the third one, and again, this is a really quick primer. I could spend multiple webinars talking about each one of these, but I wanted to give you a bit of traction around some of them, is the safe systems approach. And this one is very, very human-centered. And so really when we look at the safe systems approach, it's saying that we know that people will make mistakes and that people and humans have a finite tolerance for injury. And so what we need to do is look at the whole environment around road users and ensure that it's safe as well, and that it protects them, much like Vision Zero, in case they falter. So that's where we see safe road use, safe roads, safe speeds, and safe vehicles as main focuses rather for approaching a framework and creating a safe system for road users. And this is the one that for today, I'm going to kind of borrow from and use their categorization to talk about some of the technology and the advancements that we're seeing in road safety. It's not a hard and fast application, but it's helpful when you look at these frameworks to understand how we can use the language to talk about different road safety opportunities, and then also apply them in our own day-to-day business operations. So strategic road safety, this is where I'm really encouraging a behavior change within each one of your day-to-day operations and your business structure. You want to start to consider all of the actors in road safety. And I know that's hard when we have priority upon priority and competing priorities, and you're just trying to get the job done and done really well. But when you start to think about everybody who's involved in that road safety puzzle, you'll start to see there's different relationships that you can leverage. You can also start to think critically about your role. So maybe, you're responsible for a municipal contract related to lines and signs on roadways, but start to think about what other roles that you could play in doing that, or communicating about the work that you're doing to the greater public and how that could enhance safety. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and give you an example later on. And then finally, assessing those opportunities for strategic operations, communications, and partnership, because these will allow your business to grow, and not just within your own vertical, but across the rest of the industry too. So let's talk about some innovation and what's happening in the safe vehicles landscape. So first off, are autonomous vehicles, and this should be no surprise to anybody, but just as a bit of a primer to catch you up, this is really heralded as the next wave of the future and a tremendous opportunity, not just for private passenger transportation, but we're also seeing it across commercial trucking, delivery for goods. And this is something that experts are talking about as having the potential for safety. This is a huge opportunity because if everybody is in an autonomous vehicle and these vehicles are communicating on a network and all moving at the same pace, working together, and there's, no issues with any of that connectivity or technology, this really has fantastic potential to be safe. However, there's a lot of learning to be done, and it's a bit of a bumpy road to get there. So currently, we actually have autonomy in a lot of currently produced vehicles, and I'm sure you can think of some of the big brands that you've seen out there, but even if your car has parking assist or lane departure assist as well, that's actually a form of autonomy. And we see that these different levels of autonomous vehicle are graded on varying levels. And what's happening is the developers, the technology companies, vehicle manufacturers, they're all racing to produce the next great thing. And government regulations are actually actively trying to catch up. So that's the first initial sort of hiccup that we start to see. And autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars or any other kind of vehicle, they also require infrastructure to support them as well, whether that's a beautifully painted highway or signage that the cars can actually read with their various radars and sensors. All of that has to be present for the vehicle to operate effectively. So that's kind of where we're at with autonomous vehicles. Again, I could do a huge webinar just on that. But the opportunities for you working in transportation, and again, these are suggestions, is to really start to follow this trend. How does technology communicate with roadside signage and technology? So if you're using LED boards to mark a work zone, or potentially you're producing signs as part of your business operations, how can you start to integrate technology, if you're not already, that works with current and future autonomous vehicle technology? One of the other things that we're seeing, particularly now, as some vehicle manufacturers start to release beta versions of full self-driving mode, is that people are installing it and allowing their cars to drive from themselves. And it's tempting, it's new technology, and early adopters are excited for it. But really, that starts to pose a risk if people aren't handling their cars appropriately, especially when we don't have that ecosystem I talked about that supports them in terms of that infrastructure. So maybe it's if you're developing a project or a proposal to work with a municipality, it's including an opportunity to work with local media contacts to provide messaging around drivers' continued responsibility for safety. Maybe it's sponsored by your organization and it's a radio play or an article in the paper or some sort of press release that really reminds people of their responsibility when they're behind the wheel, even if their car drives for them. And then finally, the best thing that you can do is really start to track and understand what's happening around testing regulations, as well as policies for driving autonomous vehicles. Different jurisdictions are handling it very differently, and understanding effectively what's happening can help you to make business decisions that incorporate some of these earlier opportunities. Second thing I wanted to talk about was micromobility. And this is something that's exploded, particularly throughout the pandemic. People were looking for alternative options to transit. And we've seen a whole variety of different micromobility options come out. So this is anything that could be self-propelled or electrically propelled. So scooters, skateboards, other devices. And the other thing that we've seen too in this sharing economy is that there's programs for sharing different mobility devices that are expanding and exploding, quite frankly, across cities, whether it's scooters or bicycles. These are all now part of a greater sort of network of shared devices. And these are all interesting integrations into our transportation space. First of all, you've got a lot of people who are now quite vulnerable if they're just on a bike or a scooter. They're not surrounded by the nice impact or crash tested cars. You've got people who maybe aren't wearing helmets. You've also got road systems that weren't necessarily developed for such heavy active transportation use. And so you've got mixed vehicle and micromobility types. And then also mobility sharing programs are an interesting one, because now we've got people that are leaving scooters or bicycles wherever when they're done with their trip, because that's the whole business model, is you use it and then you leave it when you're done and somebody else picks it up and takes it. And now you've got these all over providing a number of other accessibility and transportation challenges. So there's a lot happening in this space, but it's definitely one to watch, and it's growing tremendously with a lot of new entries into the race and a lot of investors also taking note. So this is a trend we'll expect to see sticking around long after sort of COVID pandemic, restrictions end and people start going back to sort of normal day-to-day commutes. Micromobility will be an effective part of that. So as a company or an organization, opportunities here, you want to factor micromobility into your program planning and design. So if you're starting to think about how your traffic control zones might look for an upcoming project, how can you also account for micromobility? Working with the city to understand is this actually something that's being allowed? Is it supported? Are you doing a pilot project to understand what you can expect? And developing clear communication through signage if you are having those traffic control zones, so people understand that they need to dismount, they need to walk them through an alternative sort of traffic control pedestrian thoroughfare. And then the final point here, opportunity, is to partner with mobility sharing programs. So if you do have some sort of community partnership or sponsorship dollars, this is a great way to start to connect with others in this industry and get your name out on another transportation or micromobility option. So whether it's sponsoring a charging hub or the maintenance of some of these micromobility tools, connecting with them is also a great way to increase your brand's visibility and take an active role in this transportation boom. Transit, feeding off the heels of micromobility, we're seeing a lot of changes in transit, whether it's electric fleets or even sustainable fleets, but also, again, not to really belabor the COVID point, but we saw a lot of changes in transportation, or transit rather, throughout the COVID pandemic. And there's a tremendous hit to transit budgets, and a lot of municipalities or cities are starting to change how their transit fleets roll out. So they're either limiting transit options or they're looking at subsidized rideshare that kind of extends their network, or partnering with different providers. And we'll talk about a first mile, last mile option a little bit later. And they're just looking at different options to reduce the costs of operating big, huge buses or streetcars and still being able to connect with their networks. Another interesting kind of road safety consideration is electric fleets. Now we're starting to, with any electric vehicle, whether it's a bus or a car, people can't hear that if they're a pedestrian or a cyclist. So how does transit start to factor into road safety if people can't hear what's coming up behind them? And then another interesting opportunity in transit is a lot of transit commissions are actually flipping over to an app-based transit and payment method. So with that, I wanted to underscore it because there's more opportunity there, whether it's partnering with a transit agency to provide some sort of in-app safety messaging about your project. So perhaps it's a road closure or an alternate route, where maybe it's reminding people as they get off the bus that they need to watch out for different traffic flow based on the project. There's tremendous opportunity in supporting the development of new transit hubs. So we're going to see a huge build out, especially as you see here, charging stations and things like that. How do you connect into the work that's happening and be a part of that in a meaningful way? And then as well as we see transit partners like your typical transit line, maybe your New York Transit or maybe Austin or any other Seattle, anybody who's looking at alternative methods, how do you start to work with them to connect with potentially an Uber or a Lyft or Bird micromobility scooters? How do you start to connect these partners together and sit at that table and understand how changes are progressing in your community? So that was a little bit about vehicles. Now let's look at sort of the road and roadside advancements that we're seeing. So one of the first ones that I wanted to touch on was this idea of equitable transportation. And I think we're starting to see, we've seen a shift over a number of years, and it's only becoming more and more evident, especially as everybody is more and more online, and we're seeing shared stories from across the country and around the world. And one of the issues that we've always dealt with in road safety and transportation is an inequity across different neighborhoods and communities related to all sorts of transportation issues, whether it's regular transit lines, lighting, sidewalks, and things like that. And you'll see this graphic up on the screen from from some of our research, but people are more likely to be using public transit to commute. They're requiring policies that really help them to do that well. And so when it comes to equitable transportation, I'd encourage you to take a look around your own community, municipality, your state, and start to look at where there's gaps in transportation, whether it's those transit lines, whether it's effective lighting, whether it's cycling lanes, whether it's sidewalks, and work with your government to take them to task and lobby for more accessibility in this space. Or partnership with municipalities, maybe it's a donation process or some preferred rates to allow for better accessibility options in lower income neighborhoods. And then also there's an opportunity to educate within your own community of your business and offer that community service, whether it's a team building day that's really going out into these communities and doing work to support better neighborhoods, or even educating about the lack of equity in some of these places so that people can be more attuned to the neighborhoods that they're moving through every day, or even may live in themselves. Another sort of on the other end of the spectrum that we're seeing is this idea of connected and smart cities. And there's a lot of different operations that are currently looking at how we take traditional data management and transportation planning, amongst other key priorities, how we take them online and put them into the cloud. And so we've seen great success. So for example, in Nevada, they've done tremendous things with cloud-based data storage and sort of cameras and sensors, all feeding into larger transportation decision-making. And the thing about this connected and smart cities, we're moving towards a direction where we'll see more increased communication opportunities between road users. So potentially it's my cell phone as a pedestrian connecting with a vehicle and allowing them to know that they're getting very close to a pedestrian and signaling it to stop. Or maybe it's starting to look at enhanced transportation planning, which is already in play, around transit routes and emergency response times. All of these things are starting to make our network for transportation a lot better and stronger. So with your sort of day-to-day operations, the opportunity here exists to connect with your local cities to understand what data is currently being collected, what's in the works, and how it can inform your decisions, potentially when you're working on a city contract or something like that. You can also start to, maybe when you're at the ATSA Expo and Convention, look at some of the traffic safety solutions that are currently out there that will connect or enable connection with this larger ecosystem in the future. And also you can start to think about how you're designing those traffic control and work zone proposals to use that relevant traffic data. So imagine if it's looking at scheduling and when the best time is for road closures. Now you have a much more up-to-date information base in terms of that data to inform those decisions and make great scheduling and closure decisions. Now we can get into safe road use, and this is a pretty broad one. It's really anybody who's on the road and using it together. And the one thing that I really wanted to highlight, because a lot of my clients aren't necessarily working directly with vulnerable road users, but like I was discussing with micromobility, we've seen this huge surge in active transportation, and there's a lot of vulnerable road users on the road. And when I say vulnerable road users, we're really talking about anybody who's, again, not in a vehicle and is more vulnerable than somebody who's behind the wheel. So a cyclist, a child, a pedestrian, or child pedestrian rather, anybody using a mobility aid, micromobility, anybody. And one of the things, especially as we've just come through daylight savings time, is visibility can be a really big issue. And that's not just because it's dark out. Also, vehicle sizes are increasing. So if you have an SUV, I'd encourage you to go home and look at your SUV and see where your blind spots truly are, and think about the height of a child and whether or not you could see a child over the hood of your car. These are all things to consider. And one thing that we see in the narrative is sort of a bit of a victim blaming and shame shifting conversation. And I bring this up because oftentimes I'll sit in rooms and committee meetings where we're discussing how to make the road safer. And it's, if everybody wore reflective clothing, then every driver could be able to see them. But then the other opposing side of that argument is, well, if every road user was paying attention, or sorry, every driver was paying attention, then we don't need people to dress up in brightly colored clothing to be able to be seen. And so really, I don't think that there's a right side of this argument. At the end of the day, I believe everybody should get home safe and sound, no matter how they choose to do that. But really, the thing here is be mindful of these conversations and think about deeper solutions and not just kind of that victim blaming and shame shifting idea. So maybe it's looking at how you can increase visibility overall for a work zone and ensure that those traffic control zones or alternative pedestrian paths are really clearly marked and easy for people to access and understand. Also, it's working within your municipality to look at the system design. So this comes back to our framework idea. And increasing the visibility solutions in the system. So whether it's longer traffic lights, more traffic lights that illuminate the roadways, marked crosswalks. There's been a huge resurgence of interest in curb lighting to indicate traffic lights. Because of TikTok, actually, that's a whole nother conversation. But there's a lot of different visibility solutions. And sometimes as a road safety or transportation company, you're the expert for a municipality. So connecting them with some of the up-to-date solutions will really help them to make more informed choices around the products that they choose to implement. And then also when it comes to roadside work and looking at protecting the people that are within your organizational family, it's really making sure that people are well aware of these road users. And so potentially it's issuing those press releases, going on the morning breakfast television programs, or going on the local radio and talking about, the upcoming road work that you're doing and the changes that people will see on Main Street, for example, and really encouraging drivers to be mindful of people that are working on the side of the roads. This sort of campaign is so helpful because you can really get to drivers when they're on their daily commute and really again, reinforce and give them that reminder that they need to look out for everybody else on the roadway. Another conversation that we're always having, it seems these days, is around the rideshare and the whole larger gig economy. So like I mentioned, we've got Uber, we've got Lyft, DoorDash. There's so many different services that will now take you where you need to go and bring you the things that you need, whether that's food, whether that's packages or deliveries. And this again has exploded during the pandemic. And I don't think that that ease of convenience is going anywhere for typical consumers. And so we'll see this stick around for a lot longer too. But the thing with this that it brings is there's more cars on the roadway because we're now shuttling people around, and as well cyclists and pedestrians who are responsible for making those deliveries. So depending on what sort of area you live in, the deliveries, whether it's food or packages, may be by car, cycle, or by foot. And you've got just a lot more people to be looking out for. And some of them are those vulnerable road users. So some of the opportunities here is to really think as an organization how you can strategically connect with the rideshare or the gig economy brands that are operating in your community and help them be better with what they're doing. So I've done this in the past with previous clients where they were developing really interesting new research ideas and functionality for their app. And they really needed to meet with a cross section of local stakeholders to help them inform their decision making and really help to develop better resources. So that's a great opportunity to have your voice heard at the table. A lot of times as well, you can also be a valuable resource to inform the educational piece and really help different organizations understand how their business impacts your business and vice versa. And then as well, if you're looking at potentially roadside work or any other major project, it's factoring in different elements that really support this rideshare and gig economy space. So whether it's incorporating more increased stopping zones for people to get in and out of cars, easier pedestrian access or signage and safe bike corridors that really help you be mindful of the future when you're developing some of these proposals. And then also it's partnering with local government to understand how regulations are going to change and how you need to really advance and change with that. And then one of our last sections here is safe speed. So this kind of corridor planning or complete streets, I've really borrowed from that framework, but the idea of a homogeneous speed zone is a proven tactic to keep roads safer, excuse me. So what I mean by that is keeping different types of vehicles or movement in transportation corridors at the same speed. So cars and buses go together, bicycles go together, and pedestrians go together. And you can see this very clearly in the diagram. And this just helps drivers and other road users stay attentive and be able to anticipate the flow of traffic a lot better. And what you need there is a really clear delineation of these boundaries. And so we've seen that a lot in different traffic islands or bike poles or bollards and things like that. To again, just help to build out a built environment to support this sort of complete street idea. And again, this is something to integrate into your planning. So whether it's, modeling this when you're doing a temporary traffic control or advocating within your city for bigger redesigns and helping to make that into a reality. And again, that's that government relations and lobbying tactic. It's also encouraging company vehicles to travel on routes that feature separate lanes. And so we've seen this with delivery trucks that companies will encourage, they only make one type of turn over another because it's safer. And so you can really start to work within your organization to pick safe streets and reduce the potential for risk or injury. And then also as part of your product offerings as a company, it's marketing those traffic safety devices like posts and bollards and doing that education so that communities understand why this is an effective thing to do and not just a hindrance to their daily commute. And one of the last sort of kind of topical issues that I'll touch on today, and I've kind of briefly run through it, is this idea of first mile, last mile. And so as urban sprawl continues, especially as people are moving out of urban centers into suburbs, transit is becoming increasingly complex. And the first mile, last mile idea is that your transit option, so a subway or a bus or a commuter train, that might be your main mode of transit into your office or back home at the end of the day. But planners and transportation advocates are now looking at other options to take you from your home to that train station or to the bus stop, whether that's a bike share or subsidized ride sharing. All of these different things really help to extend transit options and reduces the system routes for only buses and trains like that, or things like that, and offers people options, whether that's a sustainability option, an environmental option, a physical activity option. And it makes sense for cities and it makes sense for users. And so we're starting to see a lot more in terms of transit. And we're also seeing this with other things like trucking. That's a whole nother discussion. But when we come to opportunities for first mile and last mile solutions, what we're seeing is potentially subsidized transit solutions. So, coming in and partnering with some of these bike shares or ride shares or scooter shares. You're also going to see a lot of development because now if you're going to have any sort of first mile or last mile installation, you need a place to house them. So there may be opportunity to build out some of these transit hubs for people to flow through. It's also partnering with those transit solution providers, whether it's education or handing out safety devices or helping them launch it in a big campaign. And then also communicating transit options during road closures. So if there's a major shutdown in your area, helping to educate people on a first mile, last mile transit solution instead of driving point to point may be an interesting option for them. Or if you're doing some sort of road work that inhibits access to a first mile or last mile sort of meeting point, if you will, then it's really important to provide clear and effective direction in partnership with the transit agency and those last mile, first mile providers so that people understand where they're going. So I've just given you a lot of information. And I know that it can be overwhelming. And I think one of the big things that we like to do at SALT is really to encourage people to understand these blind spots every day and really understand how they can maximize the safety and the day-to-day operations of their organization and the larger community. And so we've developed the safety blind spot blueprint, and I only mention it here because we're going to be talking about it at the ATSA Expo and Convention in February. And it's really taking everything we discussed today and making it into a dynamic part of your company DNA. So you're always looking for more options. So this is just a bit of a primer, but we really walk through a 5-step program to make sure that you're harnessing all the opportunity that's available to you and also having a mind towards the future. So like I mentioned, I don't know, Donna, if you want to take the lead on this one, but I'm a newly added member to the Roadway Worker Protection Council, and I'm really excited to be a part of it. And I know Donna is on the call today, but if there's any sort of information that you'd like about this council that ATSA is newly formed, I know we are meeting soon, and we'll be meeting at the Expo and Convention too. Donna, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to.
No, that's it. I would
Okay.
say if anybody's interested in learning more about the council and the activities that we have planned, they can certainly reach out to me and I can give them more information.
Yeah, it's been fantastic so far. There's a lot of rich discussion already that's happening. And then like Donna mentioned at the top of the call, this is part 1 in sort of a 5 webinar installment. So we've got 4 more that are coming in 2022 that really focus on a number of different safety and incident response issues. So you'll hear more about that, but we're planning for 1 a quarter in 2022. But I understand there'll be some more emails that'll come about this. So more to come on that space. So with that, I'll wrap up my portion of the presentation. And just a reminder, we've got a full resource guide that encapsulates all of this available at saltandcompany.co/ATSA resources. But if you have any questions, please feel free rather to reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat with other ATSA members. So thank you so much.
Alex, thank you so much for such an interesting conversation. We really appreciate it. We did have a couple questions come in. Do you have a couple minutes to spend with us to answer?
Yeah.
Okay, great. The first is, my question revolves around how to make the re-engineering of safe and complete streets affordable for older, already built up inner suburbs with limited financial resources.
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and one that really befuddles a lot of communities. But the first thing I would say is don't let sort of the built infrastructure or the cost be a deterrent. There's a number of communities that are doing great work to use what they have or that already exists to kind of start to move towards complete streets. Remember, what I showed you on the screen is a goal, but we've seen a lot of communities do amazing things with, self-made roundabouts, with using planters to sort of create better bike lanes. We've seen pilot projects where cities will do a pilot project to just demonstrate and do a lot of data collection to demonstrate the need, and then in subsequent years secure the budget. So I would look at some low cost initiatives to start the conversation that are more accessible and use them to really build a case for the financial investment to create larger, more sustainable change in your community. And not knowing whether or not you're working on the public or the private side of this equation, certainly looking to enhance this sort of development or evolution of your built environment with partnerships from private industry. And so looking at what everybody's interests are when they come to the table, whether it's a bigger advancement towards having more electric vehicles charging hubs, or maybe it's that gig and rideshare economy, looking for better drop-off and pickup points, or looking for better cycling opportunities for some of these scooter or bike share initiatives. Sometimes those players can come to the table in a more financial way and support the greater development if they're sort of product is being integrated into the solution. So it's definitely a bit of a delicate dance to do. And you obviously have to act within accordance with, your municipality or your jurisdiction's regulations around public and private partnerships, but there is opportunity. But starting small and demonstrating the need, and also looking at success cases from neighboring communities, can be a great place to start.
Great. And another question. Culturally, it's no longer acceptable to smoke inside of buildings. Do you see any possibility that texting while driving will eventually become unacceptable behavior too?
That's a good one. So, the thing about that is vehicles right now are a private space. Let me back up. If you own your own vehicle and you're operating it yourself, that is your private place. And while there are certain legislations around, your vehicle roadworthiness and driving with a seatbelt on, cell phones and texting, especially as it gets more integrated into car technology, whether it's in the infotainment department of your car or a speakerphone situation, those are harder and harder for enforcement to really regulate and ticket. And so I think that, in terms of it going the way of smoking, when we start to see more public transportation options, whether that's ride sharing, those autonomous vehicle shuttles I talked about, or a greater integration with transit, that's where I think we'll have much more leverage to really create a safer environment, whether it's people not driving and therefore they can be on their phone, or it's more of a public or an organizational transportation system. So there's a lot of variables at play, and I would love nothing more to eliminate texting and driving, or cell phone and distracted driving. But I think, it's really right now, the actionable steps are really working to increase and enhance public education, and working at at the forefront of lobbying to really give enforcement tangible tools that they can use to enforce some of these laws. And I think that's where we're seeing it, until we're in fully autonomous vehicles and nobody has to pay attention anymore, which is very far off. So.
One more question, Alex. During COVID, we saw that there were less cars on the road, but they were going faster. They were speeding.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know what's going to happen if things are going to go back to quote unquote normal after COVID. But what do you think we should do about the speeding situation? I know that's probably a broad question, but any general thoughts that you may have?
Yeah, so certainly the epidemic of speeding during the pandemic was duly noted across all sorts of publications and enforcement reports on ticketing. I don't think anybody was immune to it, but pandemic puns aside, I think that one of the things that we'll see is that once sort of regular transportation patterns come back into play, we'll see a natural slowing in traffic. We're already starting to see that in terms of speeds. Predominantly, a lot of the speeding that was happening during COVID lockdowns and sort of stay-at-home directives was when roads were empty. So people, I'd like to believe it's a smaller set of the population that are taking advantage of emptier roads, but you will start to see as traffic congestion increases that you have almost a natural sort of speed bump of other cars on the roadway. Certainly some of the sort of lower cost or more accessible options for communities specifically are driver feedback signs that indicate when somebody is over the speed limit and by how much. Those are proven to be a really great evidence-based resource that's supported by a lot of really good research. So communities that are looking to combat this in a smaller sort of way, that's a great way to do it. Bigger systems like automated speed enforcement are having a lot of really good success with ticketing, because it's starting to increase the opportunity for enforcement without having to increase the number of enforcement officers that are on the roadway, and they can focus on other issues. So red light cameras is another example of automated enforcement, but automated speed enforcement is also a great way to do it, because then you're sort of catching people whether they realize it or not, and they get that ticket. And certainly in the absence of other enforcement measures, a financial burden is definitely a wake-up call for a lot of drivers. So
great, thank you so much. All right, it looks like we are at our allotted time for today. Thank you so much, Alex, for your time and your expertise. We greatly appreciate it. I just want to remind the participants that this is just the first in a series of 5 webinars. The remaining 4 will be held in 2022. So, stay tuned for the dates of those webinars. And we'd ask you to take just a few minutes to complete the survey that hopefully is on your screen now. It's just a couple of questions, but it helps us with the topics for the future webinars. And with that, thank you all for your time. We greatly appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.